When we talk about losing 30 pounds of fat by the end of 2025, we're not just talking about a number on a scale. We're talking about rewiring the way your brain and body interact with food, energy, and discipline. The fascinating thing about the human nervous system is that it adapts to whatever you repeatedly do. If you consistently give your body poor sleep, erratic nutrition, and low movement, your brain learns to expect and even crave those states. But when you consistently give your body structured sleep, consistent light exposure, nutrient-rich foods, and deliberate exercise, your brain begins to wire in a new identity, one of health, energy, and resilience. Now, the key is not to rely on raw willpower alone. Willpower is like a muscle, it fatigues. What really creates lasting fat loss and a sustainable shift in body composition are protocols, systems, and triggers that set your biology in the right direction. Dopamine, for example, is not just a reward molecule, it's what drives you to take action. If you learn to strategically harness it through goal setting, daily habits, and environmental cues, you can maintain motivation long after the initial excitement fades. So today, as we explore how to lose 30 pounds of fat by the end of 2025, I want you to understand this. It's not about crash diets or punishing workouts. It's about aligning your brain chemistry, your physiology, and your daily behavior so that fat loss becomes not just possible, but inevitable. And once you understand the science behind motivation, metabolism, and habit formation, you'll see that the process of transformation is already within your reach. When we talk about harnessing the power of daily habits to rewire your brain and metabolism, it's important to recognize that habits are not just simple routines. They are the fundamental building blocks of how your nervous system organizes behavior over time. The human brain is constantly adapting to what you repeatedly do. Each time you repeat a behavior, the neural circuits that control that behavior become more efficient. They require less effort, and over time, the behavior shifts from something that feels forced to something that feels automatic. This process is called neuroplasticity, and it is at the heart of any meaningful transformation, especially something as specific and measurable as losing 30 pounds of fat by the end of 2025. What this means is that the weight you carry on your body today is, in part, a reflection of the habits you've built up until this point. If your default behaviors have been skipping sleep, consuming high sugar or high processed foods, eating without structure, or avoiding consistent movement, then your brain and body have wired themselves to operate under those conditions. The good news is that neuroplasticity also means that you can deliberately rewire those circuits in favor of habits that support fat loss and metabolic health. The first step in understanding this process is recognizing that habits are built around three key components: cues, routines, and rewards. A cue is the trigger that initiates a behavior, a routine is the behavior itself, and a reward is the feeling or outcome that reinforces the behavior so that your brain marks it as worth repeating. For example, if every evening after dinner you feel the cue of boredom or fatigue, and you've trained yourself to walk to the kitchen and grab a snack, the reward is the dopamine release from the food that makes you feel momentarily better. Over time, this loop wires itself into your nervous system so deeply that you no longer consciously think about it, you just execute the behavior automatically. The way to break free from these loops and create new ones that serve your fat loss goals is not to eliminate cues or rely on sheer willpower, but to strategically rewire the loop. That means you begin by keeping the same cue, but you insert a new routine that leads to a different reward. For instance, when the cue of boredom hits, instead of grabbing food, you could insert a short walk, hydration, or even a quick breathing exercise. The reward then becomes the shift in energy and state that your brain learns to value. Over weeks and months, this rewires your system so that the automatic behavior aligns with your fat loss goals. Now let's connect this to metabolism, because habits are not just psychological. They directly alter the way your body regulates energy. When you create a consistent habit of moving your body daily, whether that's walking, resistance training, or structured cardio, your muscles adapt at the cellular level. Muscle tissue is metabolically active, meaning it consumes energy even at rest. When you habitually train your muscles, they increase their capacity for glucose uptake, fatty acid oxidation, and mitochondrial function, which are the engines of your metabolism. This doesn't happen after one workout, but through repetition that your nervous system encodes as a normal part of your daily rhythm. In other words, you are not just burning calories. When you exercise, you are teaching your metabolism to become more efficient over time. This is why habits compound. Each repetition strengthens not only the neural circuit, but also the metabolic machinery that supports fat loss. Daily habits also affect hormones that regulate appetite and energy balance. For example, when you build a consistent sleep habit, you regulate levels of ghrelin and leptin, two hormones that control hunger and satiety. Poor sleep dysregulates these hormones, driving you toward overeating and storing more fat. Similarly, consistent exposure to morning sunlight sets your circadian rhythm, optimizing cortisol and melatonin release, which influences not only sleep but also energy and metabolic rate throughout the day. These small daily behaviors, repeated consistently, literally program your hormones in ways that either help or hinder your fat loss goals. The person who builds habits around light exposure, consistent sleep, regular movement, and structured eating is programming their body to naturally regulate weight in a healthier way. This is why chasing quick fixes like extreme diets rarely works long-term. They don't rewire habits, they don't change neural circuits, and they don't set up the long-term hormonal environment needed for sustainable fat loss. Another key aspect of harnessing daily habits is reducing decision fatigue. The human brain has a limited capacity for making effortful choices each day. If you rely on motivation or willpower alone, you will burn through that resource quickly and eventually default back to old patterns. But when you turn fat loss supporting actions into habits, they no longer require conscious decision making. This frees up cognitive bandwidth for other parts of your life and ensures that fat loss behaviors occur with minimal resistance. For example, if you set a consistent habit of preparing meals at the same time every day, or laying out your workout clothes the night before, you reduce the need for deliberation when the moment comes. The habit takes over, and the behavior becomes effortless. Over time, this creates an identity shift where you no longer view yourself as someone struggling to lose weight, but as someone who simply lives in a way that supports a leaner body. It's also critical to recognize that habits are contagious within your environment. The people you spend time with, the foods you keep in your home, the routines you structure your day around all feed into the circuits your brain reinforces. If your environment constantly cues behaviors that oppose fat loss, it will be much harder to sustain change. On the other hand, if you deliberately curate your environment to cue the behaviors you want, success becomes much more likely. For instance, if every morning you keep a water bottle next to your bed and your shoes by the door, the cue to hydrate and move becomes automatic. If your kitchen is stocked with whole, nutrient-dense foods rather than highly processed snacks, the default behavior shifts in your favor. This doesn't just make fat loss easier in the short term, it makes the rewiring of your brain more permanent because your environment is reinforcing the loop. Neuroscience also shows us that habits are best built when tied to existing routines. This is called habit stacking. When you attach a new behavior to something you already do consistently, your brain is more likely to encode the new behavior. For example, if you already have the habit of brushing your teeth in the morning, you could stack a new habit of drinking a full glass of water right after. If you always make coffee, you could stack a 2-minute stretch or breathing exercise before drinking it. By linking the new behavior to an existing one, you reduce the friction and increase the likelihood of consistency. Over time, this consistency leads to rewiring at the neural level, and the new behavior becomes as automatic as the old one. In the context of losing 30 pounds of fat, this stacking principle allows you to accumulate small but powerful changes that compound into a large transformation. Another dimension is the role of identity-based habits. Research shows that habits stick more effectively when they are tied to how you view yourself rather than just what you want to achieve. If you simply say, I want to lose 30 pounds, the focus is on an external goal. But if you begin to internalize, I am the kind of person who eats to fuel my body and moves daily, the behavior becomes aligned with your identity, which is far more powerful. Every time you perform a habit, you are casting a vote for the kind of person you are becoming. Over time, these votes accumulate into a solidified identity. This shift is crucial because identity is one of the most stable constructs in the brain. If you believe you are someone who thrives on health and discipline, you will naturally act in ways that support fat loss. Even when motivation wanes, finally, it's worth pointing out that habits are not built overnight. The brain requires repetition and consistency for plasticity to occur. Depending on the complexity of the behavior, research suggests it can take anywhere from 21 to 90 days for a habit to become automatic. The key is not to aim for perfection, but for consistency. Missing one day is not catastrophic, but allowing multiple breaks in a row can weaken the neural circuits you are trying to build. This is why tracking habits can be useful. Each time you check off a habit, your brain receives a small dopamine hit, reinforcing the loop. Over time, the tracking itself becomes rewarding, creating momentum that sustains the process. In this way, habits serve as both the path and the outcome, because as you accumulate small wins, Your brain begins to believe in the possibility of large-scale transformation. Using science-backed strategies to manage dopamine and sustain motivation is one of the most powerful ways to ensure that the pursuit of losing 30 pounds of fat by the end of 2025 does not collapse under the weight of lost interest, boredom, or fatigue. At its core, dopamine is not simply a chemical of pleasure. It is a chemical of drive and pursuit. When dopamine levels rise in anticipation of a goal, we feel energized, focused, and willing to endure effort. When dopamine drops, we feel unmotivated, restless, and often look for quick hits of pleasure to restore it. Understanding how to properly regulate and harness this system can mean the difference between starting strong and quitting after a few weeks, or sustaining consistent effort across the entire journey. The first principle is that dopamine is about anticipation more than reward. Studies show that dopamine spikes not when you achieve something, but when you anticipate the achievement. This means that in the context of fat loss, waiting until you see 30 pounds gone on the scale is too far away to keep motivation alive. Instead, you need to create intermediate milestones and focus your dopamine system on those. For example, instead of framing success solely as losing 30 pounds, you break the journey down into smaller, tangible checkpoints like losing 5 pounds, being consistent with workouts for 2 weeks straight, or hitting a hydration goal for a full month. Each of these small wins provides the brain with an anticipatory target, releasing dopamine when you move toward it and keeping the system engaged over the long term. This process of chunking a big goal into smaller, achievable steps is not just motivational psychology, it is rooted in the neurobiology of how dopamine circuits function. Another critical component is learning how to separate dopamine from external rewards and shift it toward the process itself. If you always attach dopamine to the external outcome, like fitting into smaller clothes or hitting a number on the scale, your motivation will fluctuate with the speed of results, which are often slow and nonlinear. Instead, neuroscience suggests that when you attach dopamine to the effort, to the very act of showing up and doing the work, you create a much more sustainable loop. For instance, telling yourself, I get stronger every time I push through a workout, or I'm building resilience every time I resist an unnecessary snack, teaches your brain to release dopamine during the process, not only at the outcome. This is known as reward prediction error. If the brain expects pleasure only at the finish line, it will get frustrated when the result takes time. But if the brain learns that the effort itself produces a dopamine release, the motivation system stays active every day. Regardless of how far you are from the final goal, it is also important to be aware of how modern environments hijack the dopamine system. Highly processed foods, constant digital stimulation, and quick, fixed pleasures create abnormally high spikes of dopamine. The problem is that when dopamine spikes too high, it is inevitably followed by a crash below baseline, leaving you less motivated and more prone to craving another hit. This is the cycle behind overeating junk food or endlessly scrolling social media. To sustain motivation for fat loss, you have to protect your dopamine system from these artificial spikes. This means limiting processed sugar fast food and hyperpalatable snacks that train the brain to seek instant reward at the expense of long-term progress. It also means regulating screen time, especially around workouts and meals, so that your dopamine is not constantly being drained by rapid, shallow stimulation. By lowering the frequency of these artificial peaks, you allow your dopamine baseline to recover, giving you more natural drive to pursue meaningful, effort-based goals like exercise and nutrition consistency. Another science-backed strategy involves using variability to keep dopamine engaged. The brain responds powerfully to novelty, and when behaviors feel monotonous, dopamine release declines. This is why many people start a workout or nutrition plan enthusiastically but soon feel bored. To counter this, you can deliberately introduce variation into your routines. For workouts, this could mean alternating between strength training, cardio, mobility work, or outdoor activities. For nutrition, this could mean experimenting with new recipes, spices, or meal timings. Even small variations signal novelty to the brain, sparking dopamine release and making the behavior more engaging. However, the key is to vary within a consistent framework. Randomness without structure can break habit loops, but structured variation within consistent effort keeps both habit and motivation intact. For example, always training at the same time each day preserves the habit, while changing the style of workout preserves the dopamine engagement. Cold exposure, deliberate breath work, and even structured fasting are additional tools that can help regulate dopamine levels. Cold exposure, such as taking cold showers or ice baths, has been shown to increase baseline dopamine levels significantly, sometimes by more than double, and sustain that elevation for hours without a subsequent crash. This makes it a powerful tool to naturally enhance drive and focus, which can then be directed toward exercise or disciplined eating. Similarly, structured fasting can recalibrate dopamine sensitivity. By abstaining from constant eating, the dopamine system resets, making simple, healthy foods feel more rewarding while also reinforcing discipline. Breathwork and mindfulness practices help regulate the stress response, which interacts with dopamine to shape motivation. Too much stress can blunt dopamine release, while controlled stress through deliberate practices teaches the nervous system to stay balanced. Keeping motivation accessible even under pressure, one of the most overlooked aspects of sustaining dopamine-driven motivation is the role of self-directed narrative. The language you use internally literally changes the way your brain encodes effort and reward. When you frame effort as suffering, I hate this workout, I can't stand eating clean, the brain links the behavior with negative prediction, suppressing dopamine release. But when you reframe effort as growth, this discomfort means I'm getting better, this discipline is who I want to be, you shift the brain's association, allowing dopamine to be released during the same activity. Over time, this reframing becomes automatic, and the brain comes to view effort as inherently rewarding. This is why elite athletes and high performers often speak about loving the grind or enjoying the process. It's not just motivational talk. It's a neurochemical strategy for sustaining effort over long periods. It's also valuable to understand that dopamine operates on a cycle of peaks and troughs, and that you cannot expect to feel maximum motivation every day. The science shows that after a peak of dopamine, there is always a drop, sometimes below baseline, before it stabilizes. This is normal, and expecting constant motivation is a mistake. The strategy here is to anticipate the low phases and plan habits that don't require high dopamine to execute. For example, on days when motivation is high, you might push yourself harder in training or meal prep. On days when dopamine is lower, you rely on simpler habits that are already ingrained, like a daily walk, a minimum water intake, or a set bedtime. By matching your behaviors to the natural dopamine rhythm, you stay consistent even when the emotional drive is low, and the consistency itself brings the dopamine system back into balance. Lastly, managing dopamine is not just about avoiding excess and creating novelty, but also about aligning your goals with deeper sources of meaning. Dopamine is amplified when the pursuit of a goal connects with your identity, your values, or a larger purpose. If losing 30 pounds is tied only to external validation, the dopamine system will eventually burn out. But if it is tied to something larger, like being healthier for your family, unlocking more energy for your career, or proving to yourself that you can master discipline, dopamine release becomes more stable because the brain perceives the pursuit as essential, not optional. Meaning stabilizes motivation because the anticipation of fulfilling a core value creates a stronger and more consistent dopamine response than chasing a superficial reward. This is why people who connect their fat loss journey to a deeper mission often find themselves more resilient, less dependent on fleeting motivation, and more able to endure the discomforts that inevitably arise along the way. Building an environment that makes fat loss automatic and sustainable begins with the understanding that the brain and body are not operating in isolation. They are constantly being shaped by the signals, cues, and structures in the surrounding environment. Every food that sits within reach, every schedule you keep, every social interaction, and even the design of your physical space is sending a constant stream of information to your nervous system about what behaviors are easy, what behaviors are normal, and what behaviors should be repeated. This means that when it comes to losing 30 pounds of fat by the end of 2025, the environment you create around yourself will either accelerate your progress or quietly sabotage it. The beauty of this principle is that by intentionally structuring your environment, you can reduce the need for willpower and make the behaviors that lead to fat loss the default choice rather than the uphill battle. The first place to examine is the home environment, particularly the kitchen and food storage spaces. The foods that are most accessible are the ones most likely to be consumed. This is not about discipline or weakness. It is about the way the human brain is wired. When you are tired, stressed, or distracted, your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for willpower and conscious decision-making, has less control. In those states, you are far more likely to default to whatever is easiest. If your pantry or refrigerator is filled with processed snacks, sugary drinks, and high-calorie convenience foods, then in moments of low energy, those foods will become the automatic choice. To build an environment for sustainable fat loss, you invert this structure. You stock the kitchen with nutrient-dense whole foods. You keep fruits and vegetables washed and ready to eat. You store protein-rich foods in easy-to-reach areas, and you minimize or eliminate the foods that derail progress. This doesn't mean you can never have treats, but it means you control their presence and accessibility so that they no longer dominate your automatic decisions beyond the kitchen, the physical arrangement of your environment matters. Visual cues are powerful triggers for behavior. If your workout equipment is hidden in a closet or your walking shoes are buried under other items, the likelihood of exercising decreases. But if those shoes are by the door, if resistance bands or dumbbells are visible in a common area, or if a yoga mat is rolled out in the living room, the cue to move is constantly present. These subtle visual reminders reduce the activation energy required to begin a habit. Over time, this repetition turns into automatic behavior. The same principle applies to hydration. If you keep a water bottle within arm's reach throughout the day, you will drink more water simply because the cue is visible and the action requires little effort. In this way, the environment shapes behavior without requiring conscious thought. Each time structure is another critical dimension of environment. The way you schedule your day, the rhythms you repeat, and the routines you establish become the invisible scaffolding for behavior. If your day is chaotic with no predictable structure, then eating, exercising, and sleeping will become inconsistent, which makes fat loss extremely difficult. But if you establish consistent times for meals, workouts, and rest, those behaviors anchor themselves into your circadian biology. The body thrives on rhythm, and when you align your eating and movement patterns with consistent time cues, your metabolism operates more efficiently. For example, eating at roughly the same times each day helps regulate insulin and digestive hormones, while exercising at consistent times builds neural associations that make the activity more automatic. Scheduling is often overlooked as part of the environment, but in reality, the temporal environment is just as influential as the physical one. Social environment may be the most powerful and underestimated factor. The people you spend the most time with influence your habits, often without you realizing it. Studies show that behaviors such as eating patterns, physical activity, and even body weight can spread through social networks. If you are surrounded by people who consistently overeat, skip exercise, or dismiss health, you will feel more friction in pursuing fat loss because the social norm pulls in the opposite direction. Conversely, if you intentionally spend time with people who value health, fitness, and discipline, their behaviors reinforce your own. This doesn't mean abandoning existing relationships, but it does mean seeking out communities, whether in person or online, that normalize the behaviors you are trying to build. Joining a fitness group, following nutrition-minded communities, or even sharing progress with a supportive friend can dramatically increase the sustainability of fat loss because the environment of social reinforcement provides a steady supply of accountability and encouragement. Another aspect of environment is the way you manage stress and recovery. High-stress environments lead to elevated cortisol levels, disrupted sleep, and impaired decision-making, all of which contribute to fat retention and unhealthy eating. Creating an environment that promotes calm and recovery is as important as creating one that promotes activity and discipline. This might mean designing a sleep-friendly bedroom with minimal light, cool temperature, and no devices. It might mean creating a morning routine that involves sunlight exposure and deep breathing instead of scrolling through news or social media. These environmental structures signal to the nervous system that it is safe and regulated, which reduces stress-driven cravings and makes it easier to stay on track with fat loss goals. When the environment you inhabit reduces baseline stress, the likelihood of succumbing to emotional eating or skipping workouts decreases dramatically. Digital environment is another modern factor that cannot be ignored. The devices, apps, and digital platforms you interact with daily influence your habits in powerful ways. Constant exposure to advertisements for unhealthy foods, endless streams of entertainment, and the dopamine roller coaster of social media can erode motivation and pull you toward impulsive choices. By curating your digital environment, unfollowing accounts that normalize unhealthy eating, limiting notifications that constantly demand attention, using apps that track habits or provide accountability, you shift the digital cues in your favor. Even small adjustments, like setting your phone background to a motivational reminder or placing health-related apps on the home screen, can reorient your daily micro decisions toward fat loss. Environmental design also involves planning for friction. Friction is the resistance that makes a behavior harder to perform. By increasing friction for destructive habits and decreasing friction for constructive habits, you can tilt the balance of behavior in your favor. For instance, if you keep unhealthy snacks in the house, you can increase friction by placing them in an opaque container at the back of the pantry while keeping healthy snacks visible and accessible. If you tend to skip workouts, you can decrease friction by laying out workout clothes the night before, packing a gym bag in advance, or choosing a gym close to home or work. Each of these adjustments removes small barriers that would otherwise provide excuses to avoid action. Over time, The cumulative effect of reducing friction for positive behaviors and increasing friction for negative ones creates an environment where fat loss happens more naturally. One of the strongest advantages of building a supportive environment is that it reduces the reliance on high levels of motivation. Motivation fluctuates because dopamine fluctuates, but environment remains steady. When your environment is properly designed, even on low motivation days, the cues, structures, and defaults push you toward the right behaviors. This is what makes fat loss sustainable. You are no longer fighting against your surroundings, you are being carried forward by them. This is also why people often find it easier to stay on track when traveling with disciplined friends, attending structured retreats, or joining fitness challenges. The environment during those periods is carefully designed to cue health, promoting behaviors. The goal is to bring those same principles into everyday life so that your own home, schedule, and social circles become the retreat that supports your goals. Finally, it is essential to understand that environments are dynamic, not static. They evolve with you, and as you lose weight and change habits, your environment should also adapt. In the beginning, you may need stronger guardrails, such as completely removing certain foods or tightly scheduling workouts. As those behaviors become ingrained, you may loosen some restrictions while adding new cues to support advanced goals like performance training or refined nutrition. The key is to remain intentional about environmental design, recognizing that every change you make to your surroundings is either reinforcing the identity of a person losing fat or undermining it. By staying conscious of this and making deliberate adjustments, you ensure that fat loss is not just a temporary push, but a sustainable lifestyle shift built into the very structure of your daily environment.